This is a reading from Characters of the Reformation by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 3, Catherine of Aragon. The marriage of Henry VIII with Catherine of Aragon was of critical importance. Her age and character, the reactions of these upon Henry, her position in Europe, and everything else connected with her are of interest and moment to the understanding of the Reformation. Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of two very remarkable people, Isabella, who on the death of her brother became heiress to the kingdom of Castile, and Ferdinand, who had been from early youth the king of Aragon. All the Spanish independent sovereignties had spread southward from the Pyrenees in the reconquest of the country from the Moors, who had overrun it in the high tide of Mohammedan enthusiasm in the century after Mohammed's own lifetime. The chivalry of Christendom used to come volunteering year after year to join in the great struggle. They were rewarded by portions of the conquered lands, and ultimately the whole of what we call today Spain and Portugal, that is, the whole of the Iberian Peninsula south of the Pyrenees, had been reconquered for Christendom, except the southern strips round about the Sierra Nevada near the sea, called Andalusia, with its capital at Granada. Aragon and Castile were the two main kingdoms of the peninsula, and by the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, all that land except Andalusia, which still remained to be reconquered, and Portugal, which had developed into an independent Christian kingdom, were in one family. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella united Spain. The marriage had taken place in 1460, and the crowns were united after a civil war in 1479. In 1492, the same year as that in which Columbus discovered America, but earlier in the year, the full conquest of the peninsula was accomplished. The Mohammedan capital of Granada fell, and the last shred of Mohammedan foothold in Western Catholic Europe was destroyed. All this added greatly to the prestige of the now united Spanish crown, and of course, when it was appreciated what the discovery of America meant, that prestige rose higher still. When it was a little later appreciated what an immense wealth would come to the Spanish sovereigns from their claims in the New World, it rose higher again. Hence, when Henry VII, with his base lineage and lack of claim, his haphazard acquirement of the English throne, arranged the marriage between his family and the Spanish royal house, it was a very great thing indeed. There could be no comparison in the wealth or importance of the two. Ferdinand and Isabella, the house of Aragon, had a son who died before he could become king. They had also two daughters, Joan and Catherine. The latter was to become the wife of Henry VIII and Queen of England. Joan was of weak intellect and died probably quite deranged. She bears the nickname in history of Joan the Mad. She was the elder, and therefore able to transmit to her posterity the kingdom of Spain. She was married into the highest family in Europe, the family of the emperor. The Emperor Maximilian of the family of Habsburg, having for private inherited domain the Archduchy of Austria and other lands adjoining, as well as what we now call Holland and Belgium, and a great deal more in that district through a marriage with the heiress thereof, had a son, Philip, who would succeed his father in the sovereignty of all this great but scattered territory, and probably, though not certainly, be elected emperor after him. For a man became emperor not by inheriting from his father, but by election at the hands of the great magnates, lay and clerical, who governed principalities and dioceses among the Germanies, nor was he technically fully emperor until he had been crowned by the Pope. The office of emperor was much the greatest in Europe, though it had no strong immediate political power, having no army of its own nor any revenue of its own, but depending upon the goodwill and support of the German princes. However, in itself, to be emperor was the greatest thing one could be. To marry the emperor was the greatest marriage one could make. When, therefore, Joan of Aragon married Philip, this son of Maximilian, bringing with her the newly united kingdom of Spain, which her children would inherit as her brother was dead, there was united, in prospect, under the rule of one man, Philip of Habsburg, the empire, and in direct rule large territories, including the immensely wealthy Netherlands, with their great mercantile towns, southern Italy, which was part of the crown of Aragon, and all Spain, with that new wealth which it was now seen was going to pour in from beyond the Atlantic. It was a marriage which looked as though it would put into one hand much the greatest part of power in Europe. The only great country standing outside the combination was France. England was still inferior in numbers and wealth. Scotland, smaller still. Portugal, also small. Italy, divided into various principalities. The Christian empire of the East had gone down before the Mohammedan. Russia had not yet emerged. Hence, it looked as though the family of Joan and Philip would overshadow all Christendom. Philip died before his father Maximilian, and when Ferdinand of Aragon was dead, and Isabella as well, the son of Philip and Joan, whose name was Charles, succeeded to his grandfather Maximilian. He, therefore, became sovereign of Spain, and the new discoveries in America and of the Netherlands and German Burgundy and Austria and all the rest, and what was more, he was elected to the empire as his grandfather had been, becoming emperor in 1519. The result of all this was that during Catherine's later years, when she was Queen of England and mother to the heiress of England, and later still when her husband was thinking of divorcing her, she was not only great politically as the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, or as the wife of the King of England, but still more as the aunt, greatly revered and beloved, of Charles V, Emperor and King of Spain, and far the greatest figure in Europe. Catherine was born in December 1485, the same year in which Henry VII had usurped the crown of England by the lucky accident of the Battle of Bosworth. She was betrothed to the heir of this English king, bringing with her the promise of a large dowry. This young prince was only 15 years old, and when he married Catherine on November the 14th, 1501, she was not quite 16. Here there are two things to be understood by a modern person to whom the conditions of that time are necessarily strange. First, royal marriage of this sort between people who were still little more than children gave no scandal. They were a matter of course. Second, the question of a cash dowry was without question most important. The reason for the first of these points was this. In the old United Christendom, there were no wars of conquest, properly so called. Catholic morals did not admit the idea that any Christian prince was independent of the general scheme of Christian unity. He might put in a claim to a piece of territory, saying that he had a better right to its inheritance than the actual owners. He might fight to substantiate his claims, and no doubt his claim might be a flimsy one, but the modern idea of merely taking a thing by force from other Christians and then ratifying your theft by treaty occurred to no one. The way in which states increased their powers, or as they would have put it, the way in which reigning families increased their powers was by making marriages, which would bring them in either large sums of money or new territories from which further taxes could be gathered. Therefore, purely political arrangements were made by which quite young people, sometimes infants, were betrothed. The betrothal was not valid in the eyes of the church, of course, until it had been ratified by the younger people after they had come to the proper age. But the two powers would hasten to have the marriage celebrated as soon as possible after the earliest canonical age allowed by the rules of the church. Therefore, young people of this rank were often married at such an age as saw the marriage of Catherine and Henry's seventh heir, Prince Arthur. The marriage did not become a real marriage, as a rule, until somewhat later. See the footnote on page 22. I'll reread it for you. Actually, this marriage was a real marriage, but was not indissolubly complete. In order to have been indissoluble, the marriage would have had to be both ratum, or ratified, by the exchange of vows in the presence of the proper witnesses, and consummatum, or consummated, by physical union. Lacking this latter element, the marriage, though valid, could nevertheless be dissolved by the Pope under certain conditions. Editor, 1992. All this must be borne in mind when we consider the case of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII's divorce from her. This young Prince Arthur, younger even than his wife, died 4.5 months after the marriage, on April 2nd, 1502, and young Catherine was left a nominal widow at the court of her scheming father-in-law, Henry VII, the Tudor King of England. The next point to consider, for it was important, was the question of her dowry. Governments in those days did not spend in proportion to the total national wealth, anything like the amount which they spend today. Often they spent less than 1/50th of what a modern government will spend. There were hardly any national services. There was no national army, only a small bodyguard round the king. No real national navy, only a few ships belonging to the king, and not kept up as a regular force. Most of the administration of the country was local, paid for and looked after by local lords. The cost of the administration of justice more than paid for itself by fines and fees. There were no permanent national debts. As England, of some 4 million people, had a total wealth perhaps 1/20th of the modern wealth of England, and cost the government no more than could be normally provided by the private income of the king, though that often had to be supplemented by all manner of expedients in the way of forced loans, and in times of strain, such as wars, by summoning national assemblies and begging people to give by way of exception, and not to form a precedent, sums of money to meet the difficulty of the moment. There were no regular taxes beyond the dues which men directly holding of the king paid to him as their lord, and which more or less generally resembled customary, not competitive, rents. The consequence of such a state of affairs was that comparatively small sums of money could make a great difference to any reigning family. Put in terms of modern money, the private income of the King of England and all that he could get from his own estates, he was much the richest man in his own kingdom, from the wastelands and forests and customs at the ports and proceeds on the administration of justice, was not in modern money £2 per head of the population. Probably it was more like £1 a head, if that, even in the case of an exceptionally businesslike and grasping monarch. Therefore, a large cash dowry paid over on marriage into a foreign royal family made a big difference. Now, Ferdinand and Isabella promised such a large dowry with their daughter Catherine, but they could not pay it all at once. There was a debt owing, and this had two important consequences. In the first place, it made Henry VII of England anxious, in spite of his son's death, to keep the money which he had already had of the dowry, and to keep his claim for the balance. In the second place, it gave him a hold upon the kingdom of Spain, and made him secure in his alliance with that power. Hence, the betrothal between young Catherine and Arthur's little brother Henry, now the heir to the throne, who was later on his father's death to become Henry VIII. A dispensation was required, of course, because it was neither affirmed nor proved that the marriage between Catherine and Arthur had not been consummated. There was a good deal of debate, as we have seen in talking of Henry VIII, upon whether the Pope could give such a dispensation, that is, upon whether the prohibition against marrying a deceased brother's wife were a matter of divine or of human law, since, of course, the Pope cannot dispense from divine law. However, the dispensation was obtained from Pope Julius II in 1504, and after Henry VII's death, young Henry VIII, then a few weeks short of his 18th birthday, married Catherine. She was 5.5 years his senior, but still quite young. They had been brought up together, and Henry was delighted with and determined on the marriage. In the interval between Arthur's death and her marriage with Henry, Catherine had a very difficult time. She could not speak English. Her French was doubtful. Her native Castilian was the only tongue in which she could think or express herself readily. She had but one close friend to remind her of home, a confessor of the same nationality as herself, and she was told not to be too intimate with him. Her wretched father-in-law, Henry VII, had proposed at one moment to marry her himself, and even got the unfortunate child to write a letter saying that she was willing, but the indignant protest of her mother Isabella put an end to that project at once. Her marriage with young Henry, therefore, was a relief, and, as she was at that moment, it was also a delight. She was very fond of him, as he was of her, but she was unselfish, whereas he was already one of the most selfish young men alive. The difference in age, which had not yet affected Henry's feelings, gave her yet a stronger feeling of affection, a protective feeling for him, and he was greatly under her influence. In person, Catherine was short, broad, and fair. Active enough in body, she had one very pleasing mark, which was a charming temper. She was friends with everybody and always smiling, universally popular, and at the same time busy in all her employments as queen. She was thoroughly liked by her subjects and by everyone about the young court. She was pious, as for that matter was Henry too, after his fashion, but she was more rigid and austere in her Spanish piety. She had one defect in the business of governing, which was a virtue in itself, and would have been an advantage in any other position, though it was a disadvantage in the position of queen. She was very simple. It went with being very direct and straightforward, but she could not understand intrigue. She did not trouble to sound people's motives. She was rather too easily taken in. Over and over again during her life, she acceded to proposals which would have been to her disadvantage, and from which wiser and more corrupt people had to dissuade her. But she was industrious, and looked well after any affair that she undertook, and her servants and dependents were devoted to her. She ruled her household well. She acted as regent while her young husband was away at the wars in France. She was responsible for the great victory of Flodden 5 years after her marriage. Had Henry continued to receive her influence throughout the remainder of his life, it would have been well for both of them, and especially it would have been well for England. In active affairs, all that Henry did, especially in foreign policy, was more and more managed by Wolsey, the great cleric and statesman who took over the government of the kingdom and whom Henry wholly followed. But Catherine did not clash with Wolsey. She quite understood how superior was his intelligence and energy, and what great capacities he had for holding the helm of the state. The trouble between her and her husband, which broke her heart and made of the whole of her life so great a tragedy, came from two things. First of all, it came from the wretched instability of Henry's character, sensual, capricious, unable to control appetite, and abominably indifferent to the sufferings of others, spoilt in every way, and spoilt, I am afraid, not a little by Catherine herself, who had made no effort to check him in spite of her affection. Secondly, it came from her bad health, or at any rate her misfortunes in the matter of children. It is true that the king's own debauchery was responsible for her health later on, but I doubt whether it was responsible for it in the first year of the marriage. We have no direct proof, of course, one way or the other, but it seems unlikely from all that we know of his actions and appearance when Henry first married her that he was not then a healthy man. But later, she had miscarriage after miscarriage, and stillborn child after stillborn child. Only one child survived, Princess Mary, born in February 1516. There was no son and no other surviving issue when 5 years later it was known that Catherine could bear no more children. That was round about 1521 or 22. Now here arises an important point. To what extent was Henry influenced in the abominable thing he did by the desire for an heir? Did his wronging of Catherine have any excuse in his disappointment at having only a daughter to succeed him? The whitewashers of Henry and the defenders of the great tragedy of the Reformation have argued with all their weight on that side. They have pretended in different degrees of sincerity that Catherine's ill success in providing him with an heir is the root of the affair. No one who reads the contemporary documents of the time can believe that. The root of the affair was Henry's miserable infatuation with Anne Boleyn. But the first duty of the historian is to be just, and we must allow a certain weight to Henry's desire for a male heir. These things cannot be put in exact proportion or percentages, but if one attempts to put it thus, and give the disappointment that the lack of an heir from 1/5 to 1/4 of his motive, one may perhaps roughly represent the weight which it bore. He was somewhat worried by not having a male heir because his throne was not too stable. His father had been a usurper and only captured the throne 24 years before his son's accession. It was in its way important to leave a son to carry on the dynasty. On the other hand, the greatest thrones in Europe were handed on through women. Spain itself was a splendid example, and the little Princess Mary was so popular with everyone and would have been so thoroughly supported that there was no real danger. Put forward as the main excuse for the divorce, the pretense that the necessity for a male heir was the leading motive was falsehood and hypocrisy. When it was clear that Catherine could bear no more children, Henry gradually deserted her. He had several affairs. He took up with a woman who he had known in boyhood, one Blount, and had a son by her, whom he called the Duke of Richmond. He also took up with the daughter of a courtier and diplomat of his called Boleyn, a young lady of the name of Mary, and when he was tired of her, he married her off to one of his other courtiers with a portion which did no credit to his generosity. He probably ceased to live with his wife as early as 1521, when he was no more than 30, and she, poor woman, still under 37. Even by his own admission, and he was a great liar, he ceased to live with her within the next 3 or 4 years. It was about 1522 that he first noticed Anne Boleyn, the sister of Mary, probably with the object of making her his mistress, and it was probably about around 1525 that they came to some arrangement together to try and get rid of Catherine and conclude a marriage. The first document dealing with the divorce is dated 1526, when Catherine was 41 years old and Henry 35. The first open steps taken for obtaining the divorce were in the next year, 1527. During all these half-dozen years of strain and contumely, Catherine bore herself with admirable dignity and restraint, probably with too much restraint. She might have done better had she protested, for Henry still stood in some fear and respect of her, and though he was passionate and would have outbreaks when he was thwarted, he was, like nearly all sensual men, subject to the control of stronger characters than himself. But Catherine made no attempt at any such control. Though Anne Boleyn was one of her maids of honor, closely attached to her at court, she neither made scenes nor intrigued to recover her position. What she did do was to remain absolutely steadfast in her determination that her husband should never have it in his power, so far as she could prevent it, to call any other woman wife and queen. On that she was inflexible, and the very simplicity of her character lent her strength. As the shameful efforts against her legitimate position increased in violence, when Wolsey had lent himself to the plan, when all Europe was discussing it, and was concerned with the fate of the Queen of England, she remained immovable and almost silent. She depended, of course, almost entirely upon the advice of her nephew, the Emperor Charles V. His ambassador was her chief counselor. She did all by his advice. There, again, perhaps she was too docile or too humble. She might have attempted more on her own initiative, for it must be remembered that the emperor had many political ends to serve. He needed Henry's help against the rivalry of France, and his ambassador would often misjudge English affairs. Her policy, therefore, may not always have been directed on the lines best calculated to succeed, but she had what is better than policy, a perfectly clear principle, and a rigid attachment to it has made her name stand as high as it can stand from those days to our own. What is more remarkable, she preserved the esteem and somewhat shamefaced regard of Henry, even when he had refused to see her any more, probably because he was still afraid of her influence and did not like to look at her in the face. When he had pronounced she was no longer to be called queen, but only Princess Dowager, when he had had her divorced in spite of the Pope by Anne Boleyn's man Cranmer, who had been made Archbishop of Canterbury for that sole purpose, she remained exactly the same. She claimed the full title. She refused to admit the right of the court to examine her marriage with Arthur. She equally maintained the right of her daughter to be heiress to England. And when Boleyn had the child Elizabeth in September 1533, illegitimate in the eyes of all Europe and by all the Christian law, the people of England steadfastly continued to regard Catherine as the legitimate queen, and Princess Mary as the right inheritor of the throne. She did not long survive the tragedies which had been imposed upon her, and which had been borne with such steadfast courage. She died in January 1536, too early to see the fall and disgrace of her rival, Anne Boleyn, and almost her last act was a letter still full of passionate love written to the king, who had not allowed her so much as to see him for more than 6 years. It was then she wrote the famous phrase, "The desire of my eyes is to see you again," but the man had damned himself. They buried her in Peterborough Cathedral, not putting over her one of those great and splendid tombs of the Renaissance, such as all her high kindred had throughout the West, but a plain slab of black stone, on which there was not even an inscription till modern times. One may meditate with some profit on that simple and ignominious piece of masonry, the poor tomb of so good a woman who stood at the origin of such great and disastrous things. It was widely believed, and on good authority, that her rival had caused her to be poisoned. It is equally probable, perhaps more probable, that she died a natural death, for we know from the autopsy that there was a small growth upon her heart, which may have been cancerous. She died, as her daughter Mary was to die many years later, hearing Mass, the Mass that was said in her sick room. She made the responses and received Holy Communion, and it is memorable and typical of her Spanish rigidity and orthodoxy, as well as of her training in Catholic things, that when her chaplain and confessor offered to say Mass for her before the canonical hours, lest she should die without it, she bade him wait until the regular time had come, and she lived on the few hours sufficient to enjoy the fruits of her patience.